So it's time. Let's begin. Thank you those who have come back, and thank you those who coming for the first time. This lecture is somewhat self-contained, so if you weren't here last time, will be okay. But what I will do is I'd like to start with just briefly reviewing some of the ideas that were developed in the last talk, and then move on to the topic of this talk, which is the semantics of ideological words. There we go. So last time I brought forward the notion of ideology as a folk social theory. I distinguished between those which are proper and those which I called defective, that in some way they did not give an accurate or gave a false picture of the nature of reality, the fabric of reality. Developed the notion of subscribers to ideology. Those are the agents who are cognitively attached to the ideology. Institutions, which are the conventionalization of the ideology, setting sort of terms of its application, so to speak. And finally, I discussed propaganda, which is communication to support and advance the ideology. Now, to start today, I want to have a quote from Frege. And I do this because the literature on pejorative words has really become vast, and it suffers from a problem. And that problem is that terms are just thrown around and used without any really clear characterization. So it becomes somewhat hard to sort of adjudicate exactly what's being discussed. So Frege tells us the following. He says, in logic, as in other sciences, it is open to us to coin technical terms, regardless of whether the words are always used precisely that way in everyday life. It doesn't matter if the meaning we fix on is not altogether in line with everyday use or doesn't accord with the word's etymology. What does matter us to make it as appropriate a vehicle as possible for use in expressing laws. So, in that spirit, let me just be clear about terms the way at least I will use them in the remainder of this talk. The term pejorative will refer to a linguistic element. It's a word or a term with all its intended properties. So the question we've been asking is, what do these words mean? And what does this imply metaphysically? What does it imply about the nature of reality? Distinguish that from derogation, which we're using as a term for a particular assertive speech act, which predicates a pejorative term of an individual. To say that Obama is an end, for example, would be a derogation under this terminology. And distinguish both of those notions from the notion of slurring, which is a type of action which may be communicatively manifested. And the slur term will be a focal element of a slurring act. And I'll return to the notion of slur somewhat later in the talk. Now, last time I developed the notion of the theoretical abstract. And the idea about a theoretical abstract, it's to characterize what subscribers have in common that justifies and supports their subscription to the ideology and the behavior consistent with it. And the idea is that it abstracts away from particular justifications which individuals may have, which of course can widely vary. If you go up and ask, someone who's an anti-Semite, why are you an anti-Semite? God knows what they'll come up with. But we can't think of that as really reliably about what sort of characterizes the ideology itself. That's for analysis. Ideological words are meant to express the core theoretical abstract of an ideology. And these are the concepts that are expressed by ideological words. And so ideological words, so to speak, are the linguistic symbols of the ideology. They stand for and reflect directly the ideology. So ideological words, the question which we want to ask is, what is the meaning of these words? And given notions of meaning and how we understand them, we should at least distinguish and be clear to distinguish three different things. One, which we'll be interested in here today, is the semantic content, and that, as I argued in the last talk, derives from an ideology. The use derives from an institutional norms setting illocutionary conditions for allowable linguistic behavior. And finally, utterance derives from subscribers' intentional dispositions to linguistic acts consistent with use. Finally, I developed the idea that pejorative words are ideological words of morally defective ideologies, such as anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and what have you. Pejorative terms have a characteristic that they're differentiated by targeting those who are morally evaluable under the terms of the ideology, and hence they encapsulate the core theoretical abstract of the ideology. So the claim and the idea we'll be exploring was the one I laid out at the end of the last talk, and which we will hold consistently going forward now, is that the abstract for pejorative terms is something like people ought to be the target of negative moral evaluation just because of being a G. So the N word means ought to be the target of negative moral evaluation just because of being black. The K word means ought to be the target of negative moral evaluation just because of being Jewish. And because of these meanings, to call someone a K or an N or what have you is to say that they lack moral worth, and in that regard are to be taken as dehumanized. Finally, pejorative concepts are corrupt. No one ought to be the target of negative moral evaluation just because of being a G. No one should be that way. No one is, just because you're black or Jewish or what have you, that is no cause to be the target of negative moral evaluation. So pejorative words, since no one can satisfy the theoretical abstract, pejorative words express unsatisfiable, morally corrupt concepts. So N star expresses, for Fregeans, a sense whose reference is a concept with a null extension. And I labeled an ideology with empty theoretical terms as defective. So pejoratives are the corrupt language of morally defective ideologies. And racists embrace racists embrace a fundamentally false belief characteristic of a defective ideology. It's a belief that violates an a priori moral principle, that is, that no one ought to be the target of negative moral evaluation just because of being whatever. Now, given that we have a thesis that the idea that what the concept which is expressed by pejorative terms is unsatisfiable, what that means, it has a null extension. No one falls under the concept. And this plays out directly in the semantics of some very, core set of types of sentences of philosophical interest. One are metaphysical claims. So the claim that there are Ks, that sentence comes out on this theory false. There are none, so it's false. There are Jews, comes out as true. There aren't any Ks, comes out as true. There aren't any Jews, comes out as false. A second type of philosophically significant sentence are those which express conceptual relations. So sentences like no Jews are Ks, which is true. Some Jews are Ks, which is false. And all Jews are Ks, which is also false. Again, simply because there are no such things as Ks. And finally, the third case, which I'm going to come back to in some considerable detail later in the talk, we have the distinction between Jews are Jews, which is true and trivial, as one might expect, versus Jews are Ks, which is false, but non-trivial. Since there are Jews, but there are no Ks, Jews are Ks is false. Now, I've been talking about this concept, and it's by talking about it that way, I've been trying to sort of frame it out as a kind of explicative term or explicative notion for pejorative terms, okay? But the question arises, I used a lot of verbiage, ought to be, blah, 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 that has a certain structure to it. And so the question becomes, what if that is relevant to the logical form? And the argument we're going to give is that really the basic structure of the logical form is just basically that there is this concept that applies to these group terms. So pej of G, where pej covers the entire term, would essentially be read as ought to be the target of negative moral evaluation just because of being a G. Okay? So this term, this long term, is meant just in the sense of an elucidation of the concept of pejoration. And it's an explication of the pejorative term, very much in the sense that Carnap developed in trying to characterize the way theoretical terms get their content. So as I mentioned, it's a concept which has normative, moral, negative, and targeted characteristic marks. So formally, PEJ is a mapping from concepts to concepts. K star will be glossed out in terms of its logical form as PEJ Jew, N star is PEJ black, and PEJ Jew and PEJ black are terms with null extensions. Nothing falls under those terms. Okay? So PEJ G expresses the compositional structure of pejorative terms. It says it has a complex compositional structure with two parts. Now, given that logical form, we should have a look at a few things. The first thing is going to be things about the scope of negation. And the first thing we note is that negation does not scope into PEJ. Okay? Even though we're glossing out PEJ in this very complex way, it's not something which can be penetrated by various kinds of logical operators. So the proper assignment of truth conditions to some in general, the proper assignment of truth conditions to some proposition P and some other proposition not P presupposes that the meanings of the constituents of P are invariant. Okay? So let's take the following two sentences. Max is divorced, Max isn't divorced. Same meaning in both sentences. One negates the other, but the word divorce means the same thing in both cases. Similarly, if I say Max is a K and Max isn't a K, K star has the same meaning in both cases. It doesn't change under the scope of negation. So each pair states that Max does or does not fall under the very same concept. Now, it's an interesting phenomenon, and this is a phenomenon known as, which I don't actually know if it has a term in the literature, but for lack of a better term, we can call it negation denial. So take the following sentence. I say, Max is divorced. And then you return to me, he couldn't be. He's still married. And that's perfectly sensible. But you also could have said, he couldn't be. He's never been married, right? Since he's never been married, he couldn't be divorced. So it could be either way. So if we were to analyze divorced as no longer married, we can see that there's different foci of negation. The denial of, on the one hand, of no longer, he was, but he isn't any longer, versus just the denial of married. He's not been married. So we have this sort of ability under an appropriate compositional structure of words to penetrate into that compositional structure, even though it's hidden, by this kind of tool of the negation denial. So there's a nice case due to Robin Jeshian, which seems to show exactly this phenomenon. So we take the sentence, Max isn't a K star, okay? And we follow it in three different ways. He's a C star, where C star is a pejorative term for targeting Chinese people. Max isn't a K star, he's a Jew. Or Max isn't a K star, he's a Catholic. Okay, so each and every one of those is perfectly sensible as a continuation of the initial sentence. So taking K star to be analyzed logically in terms of its logical form as PEJ Jew, we have three different possible foci of denial. The first focus of denial would be Jew. That is, in the first case. It's proper to apply the pejorative, but wrong one was chosen. Okay? So it's proper to, you still want to apply a pejorative. You want to derogate Max with a pejorative, but you chose the wrong one. Okay, so that's what the first one says. So that's just denying the focus, that is the Jew part. The second part, the focus of denial, is PEJ. It's improper to apply a pejorative, but correct it, he's Jewish. So Max isn't a K, he's a Jew. Okay, so it's denying that he should be the target of derogation, but it's true that he's Jewish. And the third one is the focus of denial is the entire composition. It's improper to apply a pejorative at all, and it's incorrect that he's a Jew. So if I say Max isn't a K, he's a Catholic, I'm basically denying both of them. So what's really nice about this is that it's sensitive to showing just how sort of the composition of words, the sort of hidden composition of words, how that basically plays out in terms of the kind of logical structure that words have. And this sense of negation denial seems to be sensitive to that idea. So henceforth, we will think of pejorative words as expressing pej as applied to G, some way that's applied and versified by an ideology, what G is, and assuming that we understand pej, glossing it, or giving it its explication, the term ought to be the target of negative moral evaluation, all because of being a G. Now, I want to briefly discuss a topic that always comes up in every talk I've ever given on this term, and people really want to know about this, and this is the phenomenon of appropriation. How it happens that terms that start out as pejorative terms get depejoratized. And there's a whole lot of being said about this, but from our point of view, what we need to say about this is how does it alter the particular conceptual or semantic space that a pejorative word has? So a pejorative word has a certain semantic space, the one which has the characteristics that we've been talking about. And the appropriation, on our view, is something which shifts the space, shifts that space in certain ways. And there are two cases of appropriation. The first case is normalization, which takes pej G and drops off pej. And so this turns a pejorative into a neutral term, and probably the most well-known example of this is the term gay, okay, where gay has simply become a completely neutral term where previously it was a pejorative term. The second is, and the one which I think people are very interested in, is valence inversion. So what that does is map negative moral evaluation into positive moral evaluation. So the pejorative becomes what we call an approvative. And this is what happens with the N-word when it's used among the sort of those who are targeted, the group that is targeted when they use it. They use it as an approvative term by this basic switch in semantic space, which just changes the valence from negative moral evaluation to positive moral evaluation. Now, the question about how appropriation is affected and implemented is an extraordinarily complex problem, okay? And it ties into all sorts of things. There's no single solution for this because it depends on social, political, cultural, linguistic, historical, and economic forces and political goals. So if you just take the term gay, it was clearly a political goal and a social goal and a cultural goal to be able to make the shift to make that term that way. And it started to be used in a way, there was no in-group using. They wanted everybody to talk about them that way. Okay? On the other hand, the use of the N-word, that's clearly being reserved for the targeted group. Okay? They chose that term precisely because of the effect it would have on those who were not in the group. And there's a lot of sort of social and cultural forces at play about who's allowed to use that word. Okay? Those are very interesting questions. But I don't think any of them are philosophical questions. I think all of them fall into different domains of sociology, social psychology, and various other domains, anthropology, what have you, sociolinguistics, in order to understand the complexities. And there probably is no single solution to that. But what I think we see here is a kind of understanding what's going on conceptually when we appropriate. It's a shift in the conceptual space along one of these two dimensions, which I just mentioned. Now, I want to sort of change course here a little bit and do some very high-level history of philosophy, or at least history of analytic philosophy. Okay? Starting in the turn of the 20th century, with the rise of analytic philosophy, since then there's emerged, I believe, basically two basic ways of sort of thinking about things in the context of analytic philosophy, and in particular in the philosophy of language and philosophy of mind. Okay? On the first, which I'll refer to as conceptual analysis. And this is due to the early work of Frege, Russell, and the early Wittgenstein. And on conceptual analysis, concepts, the isolation of concepts, is the primary theoretical method for explanation of the notion of linguistic meaning. So a concept on this view picks out the objects meaningfully associated with a term. and it mediates the relationship between a term and what it stands for. So the concept somehow, the traditional idea, is that by conceptual analysis, we can understand, for example, the processes of reference, given that we take it that we refer to those who fall under a given concept. So what it does, what the conceptual analysis does, is it provides conditions that an object must satisfy to be semantically associated with a term. In the context of esoteric sentences, satisfaction conditions are compositionally derived truth conditions. That is, it's information that when evaluated relative to a world determines truth or falsity. These satisfaction conditions are cognitively significant to speakers as linguistic understanding, and they underwrite our linguistic competence for language use. Now, this way of viewing things, particularly as things have sort of moved on in time, has been motivated by the prospect of having a compositional theory of truth conditions that mirrors the compositional nature of thought. And this is, well, the value in this is really twofold. One, it can establish computational relations between thoughts that constitute the formal means for rational deductive thinking. And secondly, thoughts or propositions are the objects of beliefs, hopes, desires, and other cognitive attitudes. So it's conceptual, this conceptual framework prioritizes both the rational constraints in our cognition, that is, with respect to reasoning, and our cognitive relationship to the world relative to our hopes, beliefs, desires, etc. So the view is avowedly cognitivist. It's analytically conceptual, has an analytically conceptual cognitive orientation. The second perspective, the second sort of major perspective that I want to talk about, we can call use analysis. Okay? Where here, the primary focus is on how speakers are attitudinally disposed to actions. And this really becomes coherent in the mid-1950s, primarily in the work of Austin, Strawson, and the latter Wittgenstein. On this point of view, meaning arises from the association of attitudes with commensurate linguistic actions. So the analytic priority on this view is given to what speakers feel or do when they make an utterance over any kind of representation they may have in mind. And the prime concern is with felicity or appropriateness conditions associated with utterances of sentences, again, over their truth conditions. And there are significant sources of support for this view, which have been pretty widely discussed in literature. For example, non-assertoric sentences like questions and commands, expressions of sentiment like apologies and explanations, and more generally, expressivist accounts of normative language. So this kind of view prioritizes our behavioral, this kind of view prioritizes our behavioral relationship to the world, including that to other conversational participants, and in its philosophical perspective, it's broadly empiricist. Non-cognitive attitudes, along with commensurate dispositions and intentions, guide our behavior and take analytic priority over the cognitive representation of truth and falsity. And attitudes, those things which are sort of at the baseline here, are non-compositional in contrast to thoughts, which are composed from concepts. So this view is avowedly non-cognitivist. It's analytically behavioral. It has an analytically behavioral, non-cognitive orientation. So there are two traditions in philosophical analysis of meaning in language. The first is a cognitivist approach, or cognitivism, with a central concern is the composition of thoughts from concepts, and linguistic meaning is situated in the relation of language and mind. The other is non-cognitivism, where the central concern is the behavioral consequences of attitudes and intentions, and linguistic meaning is situated in the relation of language and action. Now, these are two very different views. These are two very, very different views, and they're both extremely influential in philosophical thought. Okay? They're contrasting frameworks where each is purporting to be definitional of the space of linguistic meaning. They both are claims about what linguistic meaning is. So the question is, are there grounds to adjudicate? Can we say of one that it is a superior or correct point of view as opposed to the other? Okay? Well, if we're going to try and cross-criticize across frameworks with such broad generality, these frameworks are very broad, okay? And they're very much guiding of the way people think about philosophical problems and what the goals of philosophy are, okay? And if we're going to sort of try to criticize across the aisle, so to speak, we have to ask, what's the common ground? What are the common terms for such criticism? Without such cross-theoretical criticism, we might just be criticizing from within. We're just saying my theory is better than yours, and since it's in this approach and it's a good theory, the other side is bad. So it would be unfair privilege to saddle the critically targeted framework, so we're going from an argument from one side to the other, with theoretical commitments that were never part of the common ground of the critical debate. We have to establish that it ought to be the case that things should be explained. So it's obviously invalid to reason from A explains phenomenon P and B does not explain P to B is to be rejected. That's obviously a fallacious argument. What has to be made clear is the hidden premise that B should explain P. That's what has to be justified in order to make the inference go through. So if we're going to take a valid stance towards critical discourse, we must be cautious not to commit what we're calling the framework fallacy. Theoretical explanations, originating from within a particular framework, have privileged and exclusive status over explanations that originate from outside that framework. So to commit the framework fallacy is to make the mistake of assuming one framework as adequate in criticizing another, when what is at stake is exactly which one is best. So we can't assume one is best to criticize the other. And I think what's happened, and why I go through this sort of metaphilosophical consideration, is because this is exactly what has happened in the literature about pejoratives. Important aspects of the contemporary debate about pejorative terms, presented as critically adjudicating between the cognitive and non-cognitive frameworks of linguistic meaning, suffer from the framework fallacy. And so what I want to do is look at a couple of major arguments that have been given to see what kind of criticisms do and do not comport with the principle. Okay, so let's start with non-cognitivism. And what does it say about pejorative terms? It says pejoratives, for example, racial epithets, and for this, non-cognitivism appeal is quite obvious. So why is that? Racists typically utter such words with hatred or disdain, disregard their targets as inferior, and have dispositions to act as such. That's just obvious, right? That's just a plain observation. So given that, it's natural to focus on conditions of felicitous use of these words. How is it that they express this disdain and disregard? And one would think would be a racial epithet, or in general one of these epithets, is only used when one harbors racist attitudes directed at the relevant group. And in fact, these attitudes or dispositions may be considered to be constitutive of the kind of oppression that's expressed through this type of language. So the truth and falsity don't even seem to really enter at all into the picture. And it's with, I think, this initial appeal that non-cognitivism has gained traction in the recent literature on racial epithets. It's a very broadly held point of view. And within this literature, there's a particular characteristic, which it seems that criticism of a cognitivist view, cognitive framework from the non-cognitive point of view has often just been taken as gospel. And it's been centered really about, there are many variations of argument, but there's one central argument which has become known as the projection problem for offensiveness of pejorative terms. And that's what I want to discuss right now. So here's the argument. If the contents of pejorative terms are cognitive, then they should be under the control of various operators on cognitive contents whose scope they fall under. They are not, so their contents cannot be cognitive. Okay, so that's the argument. Here are the examples. So we can say Wiesel is not a K-star. And we can say if Wiesel is a K-star, then Max will not be happy. We can say Max says that Wiesel is a K-star. he believes that Wiesel is a case star, and so on. But let's just focus on 1 and 2 for the moment, okay? So here we have a case where it's a negation. There's a pejorative term being used. There's a negation of it in the first case. In the second case, it's occurring as part of the antecedent of conditional. So in 1 and 2, the content of the pejorative term should be negated or conditionalized, and hence should be whatever derogatory aspects they have. In particular, 1 should not be offensive because the content has been negated, and T should also not be offensive because the content has been conditionalized. If it's offensive to say that someone is a K, then it should be the case that if you negate that, it isn't offensive for him to be called a K, okay? But utterances of these sentences can cause offense, and they always do, even with negation, okay? And even to those who are targeted, the individuals are targeted. So the content, this content seems to project out from the scope of logical and other operators, and truth conditional content should simply not have this feature. It's just not the kind of feature it should have, okay? It should be interactive with logical operators. So the conclusion, pejorative aspects of these terms is not truth conditional and hence not cognitive. And this argument has been a very influential argument in the non-cognitive literature to the extent that it's been taken to be a pretty decisive, very decisive argument against the kind of view, or in fact, the view that I've been explaining today. So what is the explanation of offensiveness that comes from the non-cognitive side? Well, here's how it goes, something roughly like this. Use is governed by attitudinal dispositions. Use of pejoratives is governed by odious attitudes. Okay, so use is governed by attitude, and the use of pejoratives is governed by odious attitudes, racist attitudes. And that pejorative words, when they're so used, that is governed by the odious attitudes, we call those are slurs. And slurs are, I guess I have to say, are probably necessarily offensive because they're always attached to odious attitudes. Expressing these attitudes is clearly offensive. Why? Because speakers are connected to odious attitudes, and the use of slurs projects this offensiveness. Slurs and slurring is non-contextually reflective of attitude. Anytime you have a slur, it will always reflect the attitude in any context of use, including conditionals and negatives. So the pejorative terms, as they're used in conditionals and negatives, are slurs. So the offensiveness of slurs projects from any context of use. So please note I'm using the term slur in this very particular way, okay? Now, the argument I've given, the projection argument, turns on a very critical assumption, okay? The critical assumption is that offensiveness is tied to or part of linguistic meaning. That somehow, if we're giving the meaning of a pejorative term, part of that meaning is somehow a notion or a feature of offensiveness, okay? But that simply is a mistake. That is simply a flat-out mistake. Offensiveness is simply not a semantic or linguistic notion. Offensiveness is a highly context-dependent behavioral notion. It is a property of actions. It's performative. So it has a type of variation very much unlike the constancy of semantic meaning. So offensiveness is something which is given and taken, but it can be given and not taken. It can be not given and taken, or it can be given and taken. So any given utterance which contains a pejorative word may not be taken as offensive, depending on the context of use. So verbal actions are a property of actions. They're performative. They're verbal acts. It applies to verbal acts can cause offense, but also all sorts of gestures. Non-linguistic verbal acts may also be offensive. Whistles, catcalls, all sorts of things, staring at people too much, all sorts of things can be offensive, which are non-linguistic. Acts are offensive. Acts are offensive because agents attribute motivating attitudes as causal. So attitudes triggering offensive behavioral acts can trigger offensive verbal acts, and this is generated by actions of conversational participants. So offensiveness is just in a different plane altogether. So the non-cognitivist demand of the cognitivist for a semantic explanation of the offensiveness of embedded pejoratives commits the framework fallacy. It assumes that offensiveness is the target explanatum for the cognitivist as it is for the non-cognitivist. But it's not. It's not relevant. Offensiveness is not relevant to the search for the cognitively significant meaning of pejorative words. Now, okay, so that seems to be a bit of a standoff. But look, there's more to the projection problem than just the cases that have been given. It's not just a matter of offensiveness projecting from logical context. It projects from a lot of other contexts. So, for example, it projects from the context of mention. So we have a case in which a racist fan yelled that word, that actual word, at LeBron. I take that sentence and compare it to a racist yelled the N-word at LeBron. Okay? Now here, as a report, the first is offensive. So offensive, I wouldn't even mention it there. So it's so able to cause offense. But of course, the latter does not. So we have, as a first case, that offensiveness can certainly project out of mention. And there's been any number of cases that have emerged, certainly in the United States, in which professors, faculty members, have been censured in some way or other because they had mentioned these terms. Okay? Now, whether that was just or unjust is another talk I have, but certainly it's the case that offensiveness can project from mention. A second case is fiction. So take the case of stage acting. So if on the stage there's a wedding ceremony, a marriage, and the actors say, "I do," it does not follow from that that they are married, right? I mean, that is certainly not, that they are married does not project out from stage acting. So actors are not held accountable for the perlocutionary effects of their speech, such as saying "I do" when they're not actually getting married. So we would expect that not only that, but fictional context should seal against offensiveness of racial epithets. But then, if that were the case, they wouldn't work in fiction. They wouldn't work in fiction, okay? They're effective precisely because they retain their force to embed. So if you think about, the classics of mid-century African-American literature, works by Baldwin, Ellison, etc., they use this term all the time. It's used all through their works, okay? But the power of their works is precisely because of the power to offend, okay? Because they're used in a way that's either offensive or appropriated or what way it's used, they gain it because of the particular meanings that they have. So the offensiveness certainly has to project, because otherwise the literary goals of the author could not be reached, okay? So there is projection from fiction with consequences and effect on readers, listeners, and viewers, and it's precisely because of the offensiveness that can be generated that it's manipulable as a fictional device, in fiction, in the context of fiction. A third case is word similarity, where there are distinct words but are phonologically similar. Famous case a number of years ago of the word niggardly, which means in English miserly or petty, in which a faculty member, a professor, was disciplined because of its phonological similarity to the N-word, when in fact it doesn't even have etymological roots in common with the N-word. Okay? Another case very recently, University of Southern California, a faculty member was censured because he was teaching, came in and used the Mandarin correlate to the word in English. When English speakers speak, they go Chinese term go neijie. And he used that term, and people thought he was saying the N-word. Okay? So those also can be offensive, just on the case of phonological similarity. Okay? But we would think, because they're neutral terms, they're non-pejorative, there should be a buffer from offensiveness. We should be buffered for similar sounding words. They don't share the same history, roots, etc. But indeed, that also projects as well. So if that's the case, if we have these expanded cases, if anything, the projection problem is problematic for non-cognitivist accounts. Because the expanded projection problem is where the offensiveness to pejoratives projects generally, not only from truth functional or intentional operators, but also from quotation, fiction, and phonological similarity. Okay? And in the expanded context, note, pejorative words are not slurs, right? Because only when pejorative words are used are they slurs. But they're not used in any of these contexts. They're either mentioned, or you have the case in which perlocutionary force is off, as in the case of fiction. And here, just phonological similarity. It has nothing to do with use at all. But yet, offensiveness comes through nonetheless. So an explanation that relies on use simply does not generalize to all of the cases, and so hence cannot be an explanation of projection phenomena. Not at least in sort of the narrow reading. Of course, one can add to it as you like. So what about cognitivism? What does cognitivism say about these cases? Well, the first observation is that what's constant across all the cases mentioned is what pejorative words mean. Okay? And given that, acting on morally corrupt pejorative concepts simply is going to be offensive. To call someone as an end and hence to say they lack moral worth and hence dehumanizing in and of itself is an offensive act. This goes along with another notion, what we call the principle of assumed extensionality. I think this is a very commonsensical notion. Sincere utterance of a term T typically indicates that the speaker believes that T is successfully referential or extensional. Use a word, people are going to generally take the assumption that you are using it properly and that it refers to something, that you're talking about something. It's just a sort of operating assumption. So, and this operating assumption is context independent. Okay? It doesn't rely on any context. Any linguistic context will do. So a speaker who utters, Obama isn't an N star, conversationally implicates that the speaker believes that there are N's, but Obama is not among them, right? Because you're assuming if speaker were to utter that, would assume the speaker believes that there are such things as N's. The utterance of pejorative word implies racist attitudes, and any context in which a pejorative word is uttered or believed to have been uttered can trigger the implicature. So offensiveness in this regard is going to be a conversational construction which builds on the meaning of the word, of pejorative words. Okay, we have and that's constant throughout, and then we'll build upon it relative to the context in which it occurs. Okay, so the first argument, the projection problem, summarize. One, simply the standard projection problem seems to suffer from the framework fallacy. But there seems to be expanded cases which at least indicate that the explanation given by the non-cognitivist, as it stands, could not be correct. Okay, so now I want to move to the other case. And this is what we call, is known as the racist Frege puzzle. So on our view, pejoratives and their so-called neutral counterparts have different meanings and different extensions. Okay? Pejoratives have null extensions, but their neutral counterparts will standardly actually have non-null extensions. So there are no Ks, but there are Jews. There are no Ns, but there are black people. Okay? So the racist Frege puzzle is simply a Frege puzzle. Okay? It's just the distinction between Jews or Ks and Jews or Jews. So Jews or Ks is non-trivial, and Jews or Jews is trivial, and as would be the case if it were Hesperus is phosphorus versus Hesperus is Hesperus. So on our account, there is indeed a cognitive difference between Jews or Ks and Ks or Ks. Jews and K star express different concepts with different extensions. And so Jews or Ks is non-trivial and false, but Ks or Ks is trivial and true. So the racist Frege puzzle has a little bit of a twist to it, and it's an important twist. Okay? The twist is that in a standard Frege puzzle, when you have Hesperus is phosphorus, that's true, as is Hesperus is Hesperus. But in the racist Frege puzzle, Jews or Ks is false, but Jews are Jews is true. So there's a little bit of a twist here, although in terms of the cognitive differences, it's a standard Frege puzzle, okay? But with this other twist, which will be important in a moment. Now, the view that I have, and that Chris Halm and I have, the view that the view that pejorative terms have null extensions and hence in that regard are distinct from their neutral counterparts, so that they have different meanings, is not the most generally held view. Probably the most generally held view is that pejoratives and neutral counterparts have the same meaning and the same extension. Okay? So pejoratives and their neutral counterparts both have non-null extensions, namely the set of Jews. So pejoratives in the sense are kind of non-fictional terms, and it follows that there are case stars is true. Now I want you to think about that for a minute. Okay? It's a philosophical theory that asserts that the term there are k's or there are n's is true, and if that's supposed to be terms that are reflective of the fabric of reality, well, I don't know, I don't think that's a great consequence, but contemplate that. If we take the view of the identity thesis, there are some very strange results. The first is that if A is a Jew and rationally denies that they are a K star, then it follows that A is conceptually confused because Jews are Ks, right? So if I say I'm not a K, I'm suffering from some strange kinds of conceptual confusion about my very self. And that just doesn't seem to be right at all, okay? I'm not confused about my own identity in this regard. Second problem is, again, what I've called the racist Frege problem. Jews are Ks and Jews are indistinguishable. They're semantically indistinguishable because Jews, the term Jews and the term Ks mean the same thing. So hence they both have the same truth value, both are true, and moreover, they both express the same thought or proposition. And they're both either trivial or not, whichever it is, but they express the very same thought or proposition. Now, prima facie, I think if this was all I was going to say, I think this would be sufficient simply to reject the identity thesis flat out. No, nothing further said. But there's more to the story. There's definitely more to the story. And the more to the story is what we call identity expressivism. So on identity expressivism, it holds the identity thesis. The identity thesis is held, but the derogatory significance of pejoratives is offloaded to some type of expressive content. Okay? So that there are both racist and non-racist attitudinal dispositions for use. Okay? Where these attitudes conventionally govern speech act behavior. So on this view, a sentence like there are Ks would come out like something like there are Jews, and this is only used by those who hold racist attitudes. There's a lot of different ways you could sort of spell this out, but that's the fundamental idea. Now, to our knowledge in the literature, there's only been sort of 2 papers, both by the same authors, by David Kopp and Adam Sennett, which have tried to sort of, I think really, they've tried to put forward, I think, really the 2 moves that can be made at this point by a non-cognitivist. So here's what Kopp and Sennett said in their 2014 paper. K star and Jew have the same meaning, but conventional felicity conditions governing the use of K star preclude a person from felicitously asserting Jews are Ks in certain contexts unless the person has a relevant negative attitude towards Jews. This would be sufficient, we think, to explain why Jews are Jews seems trivial, but Jews are Ks seems problematic, and I put emphasis on the seems, because I don't quite know why it's just the seems. So the idea here is simply that these 2 sentences have the same propositional content, they express the same thought, but there are different associated attitudes, and it's a different associated attitudes that's the locus of explanation. Well, here are a couple of objections. First of all, the account seems to say something very strange. It says that Jews are Jews. All it says that it's a felicitous assertion is not precluded. It just says it's unproblematic. So since it's unproblematic, you can felicitously assert it. Nothing follows in their account about it being trivial. Just nothing. It just says it can be felicitously asserted. But there's a deeper problem. And this seems to just simply to straightforwardly counter-exemplify the claim. When they talked about things being problematic, that was the case of Jews or K's, is the case which is supposed to be non-trivial in the Frege puzzle, okay? But just let's just tweak the example a little bit. Let's just change the example a little bit. From not just as Jews or Jews, but let's make it K's or K's as compared to Jews or K's, okay? Now, the intuition is exactly the same. K's or K's is trivial, Jews or K's is non-trivial, okay? So the Frege puzzle aspects of it are exactly the same. K's or K's is true and trivial, Jews or K's aren't, well, they would say true as well. But notice, both are going to be subject to the felicity condition. The K term, the K word occurs in both of them. So both should seem problematic and hence be non-trivial, but of course K's or K's is just as trivial as Jews or Jews. This seems to me just a complete knockdown argument against that position, and the argument is completely general. It'll rule out any analysis that is directly based on conditions to act. So Kopp and Sennett now provided another way of looking at it, okay, in a 2017 paper, in which what's involved are distinct ways of thinking, okay? Distinct ways of thinking. So K stars or K stars would be lost as something like thinks of the proposition under identical anti-Semitic ways of thinking of Jews, and Jews or K's is going to be something like thinking of the proposition under a neutral and an anti-Semitic way of thinking of Jews, okay? So then different ways of thinking of one and the same proposition is supposed to explain why the first seems trivial while the second does not. And in this regard, it would be exactly parallel to an account of the standard Frege puzzle, the Hesperus is Phosphorus versus Hesperus is Hesperus case. Different ways of thinking, you would use that as the basis of your explanation of the difference. But there's a problem, and I think this is a very odd result, okay? If a rational agent A has an anti-Semitic way of thinking of Jews, then A thinks of Jews anti-Semitically. But this is just to think of Jews as does the anti-Semite. That's just the way anti-Semites think of Jews, okay? So how can an agent rationally think of Jews neutrally and anti-Semitically simultaneously? You might ask, can they have some kind of mental schizophrenia where they could wall these two things off from one another and sort of have somehow kind of a great barrier between them? But that's the whole point of the Frege puzzle, okay? Because it's exactly what, to understand the Frege puzzle, you have to be able to look at these both ways of thinking simultaneously. That's the whole point of the Frege puzzle. To understand Hesperus is Phosphorus, you have to simultaneously be entertaining the planet Venus under two different ways of thinking about it. And this would be the case here as well, okay? Speaker is required to understand, just to understand the meaning of Jews or K's, you must consider both simultaneously. So you must be the case that anyone who understands Jews or K's on this point of view has an anti-Semitic way of thinking about Jews and hence thinks of Jews anti-Semitically. So the account of the racist Frege puzzle commits any rational agent having anti-Semitic or racist, so on, racist, etc. thoughts, and it implies complicity with anti-Semitism, racism, etc. So I think the conclusion is pretty clear. The conclusion is that the identity thesis is false and non-cognitivism misplaces pejorative content. That non-cognitivism kind of gets the metaphysics wrong about what there is by accepting the identity thesis. So let's sort of sum up here and assess the arguments. Arguments, first of all, we saw on one hand, there was an argument by non-cognitivists against cognitivists, one that went basically from non-cognitivists to cognitivists. This was the projection problem. It commits the framework fallacy, And probably it's more problematic for the non-cognitivists when the expanded projection problem is taken into account. And we saw a second argument, which was going in the opposite direction. It's an argument mounted by cognitivists who have an explanation against non-cognitivists. This was the racist Frege problem. The question now is, does it commit the framework fallacy, right? We can't accuse, because of the projection problem, we can't make the accusation of violation of the framework fallacy. We have to say this, the racist Frege puzzle does not suffer from that. And I don't think it does. I don't think we do commit the framework fallacy. It is certainly common ground that there must be a solution to the Frege puzzle. So if you look at the work of Sam and Sobes, work that Francois has done, everyone who holds that Hesperus is phosphorus and phosphorus is phosphorus, so-called direct reference theorists, who hold that they express the same proposition, is going to, in some way or other, going to invoke ways of thinking, modes of presentation on other things under other notions as the explanation, except they're going to argue, just as it's been argued here, that they're not part of the proposition expressed or truth conditional aspects. And there's a lot of variation, but that's essentially the way it's seen. So there is an assumption, that's a common ground, that the Frege puzzle needs a solution even if you hold the view that the propositions expressed by Hesperus is phosphorus and phosphorus is phosphorus is the same. So arguably, the problem of the racist Frege puzzle is one which does not suffer from the framework fallacy. So the conclusion is, this part, is that it looks like, that the problems that arise, the account that has problems is the non-cognitivists, not the cognitivists. Okay? That's what seems to be problematic. Okay? Now, it's not to say that there are not conditions on use. It's not to say that people do not harbor racist attitudes. It is to say that's what's fundamental in understanding the meaning of pejorative terms is to understand them in a cognitive way, to understand the concept they express, and then build to notions about why they are offensive when used and when uttered, to build to those notions under the constancy of the meaning of the word. So, a final conclusion. The perspective that Chris and I have dubbed moral and semantic innocence is the one I've been describing. And its concern is with the traditional philosophical questions. What concept is expressed by a word, and how do those concepts describe the fabric of reality? The fabric of reality, we claim, is that there are no such things as K's, N's, etc. It's cognitivist. Thoughts and their constituent concepts are explanatorily primary. That's the point I was just making, not non-compositional attitudes. Moral and semantic innocence is a thesis about the meaning of pejorative terms. They are ideological words. Pejorative terms reflect the content of an ideology. They express morally corrupt concepts and hence have null extensions. Thank you very much.